I think at times this battle that's going on across society, and particularly within the arts, can sort of feel like it's one about against good and evil. And it can feel quite existential, particularly if your life's work is being threatened, and it can feel quite elemental. And there are people in this room, I know, who have already been cancelled, their careers threatened, derailed, or finished. And there are people crying out, shouting a warning over the threats to women, over the threats to gay and lesbians, and the threat to children. And the way we've been treated is appalling. It's wrong, it's inhumane, and at times it is unlawful. But I really feel we have to make an effort not to become hysterical. We can't just keep sort of mirroring the way that we're being attacked. We can't become the mirror image of the hate and the fear that we are trying to fight. And I think, within this room, we probably all have our anger and we all have our experiences of trauma. But I think we need to win, and we need to win this fight. And I suppose the whole sort of thought of these arts forums is to find a way to have really good and meaningful conversations, to offer something that's more attractive, that's more appealing, what's missing in the arts, and, really embodying how much better it is to be free, to live that, to model that, and how can we do that, and that we're not against things, we're for things. So this conversation is really about us talking about certain big issues that we don't necessarily have the answers to either, from very different perspectives. So first of all, Kathleen, you're a philosopher of art. Your specialism is imagination and fiction. I just wondered if you could say a little bit about why you're here at an arts meeting.
Well, good. I'm glad you've asked me, because I do feel a bit of an imposter here, in the sense that I've seen the guest list and I know that, and obviously I'm not a practitioner, but I was, in my professional life as an academic, mainly interested in imagination and fiction. And I wrote a book, a monograph, about the relationship between the two, because I thought you couldn't understand fiction unless you understood what the imagination was, and you couldn't understand what the imagination was unless you understood what fiction was, because they seemed so centrally related to one another. And then more generally, I was what's called I worked in aesthetics, so philosophical aesthetics. So every year I would go to Oxford, in fact, to the British Society of Aesthetics meeting. And I was the secretary for 10 years and I was the vice president for a few years. And we would talk about what is art, why is fiction dangerous, is photography, what's the relationship between photography and painting, any kind of conceptual issue around literature or art, painting, or something broader, aesthetic experience, because obviously philosophers have had a lot to say about that. So I was very interested in that. My first degree was in French literature and philosophy, and I've always read fiction much more than I've ever read philosophy. I find philosophy incredibly dull to read, and it's very badly written, mostly. So I've just got an interest and an intellectual interest in these things. And then in this very strange cultural moment, it seems to me also interesting to watch. I'm involved, emotionally involved, but I can stand back and look at it and think this is actually a really fascinating time where fiction, on the one hand, we're being asked to participate in other people's fictions constantly, and we're being told we have to, but we also seem to be losing the gap between fiction and reality in other ways, so we're eliding the distinction between the performer and the performance, and between the fantasy and the reality, and that's having all sorts of knock-on effects for the arts in terms of what can be said and what can't be, and what can be played with and what can't be. So that's why I think I was invited. And I have some views, but I'm sure you will have, this, obviously, I don't have the last word on this, so I'd be fascinated to hear what you all thought as well.
Mm-hmm. And for those who don't know, I'm a dancer and choreographer, and it's quite a strange art form in that I started training when I was 3, and quite seriously from about the age of 8. And so it becomes, I mean, when people talk about identity, I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, the funny thing about dance is it absolutely is all of your body, all of your mind. It's very technical, it's very repetitious, it's very disciplined, it's actually incredibly painful at times as you're growing, as you get bigger. You have to deal with your self-image because you're faced with wall-to-wall mirrors, particularly through puberty in your teenage years. Yet also it's completely ephemeral. It doesn't exist. The minute the dancers stop dancing, it no longer exists. Yet for me, it feels like a sort of deeply concrete material art form. And it's also very mercurial in that you can express multiple complex ideas one after another without ever having to say what it is exactly that you're saying. And I like the fact that an audience watching dance has to make some sort of effort to interpret what's going on, which makes me feel sometimes a little philosophical.
Well, very philosophical. You could definitely give a paper at the British Society of Aesthetics on that.
So let's cut right to the chase here. Like, what is this cancellation stuff all about, and why particularly is it so painful for the arts world?
Well, what's it all about? Well, on one level, I don't think it's that new. I do assume that it's picking up on deeply human characteristics like competitiveness and aggression and a desire to control what other people do, and they are not new. I mean, we may have anesthetized ourselves into thinking that we're above all that, but clearly we are not. So I don't think it's new in that sense. But there's obviously a historical story to be told about how we got here, which has got something to do with, I don't know, like the commercial capitalism and the commercialization of virtue and the commercialization of morality as a kind of image. This is my opinion anyway. That so we're more and more and more focused on imagery and how things seem rather than as how they are necessarily. We're focused on branding, how we represent ourselves on social media. Universities and the arts are very focused on how they represent themselves, trying to make themselves relevant to as many audiences as possible, but they're trying to pretend that that's what they're interested in. And so it becomes about presenting an image as opposed to anything else, and it's got to be an image that sells. So I think there's something going on there. Obviously, universities are very, very interested in corporate branding and imagery and selling themselves to students. And I don't know about the art world as much, whether that's as relevant, but it strikes me that with things like the Tate, clearly they are interested in their corporate image as much as anything else.
I think there's a few things. I think the whole world of arts marketing, arts administration, it didn't actually really exist until 20 to 25 years ago. Mm-hmm. There weren't even degrees in arts administration or arts management or arts producing roles. The artists were doing it themselves, I think. And so people were multi-rolled and running organisations while still being practitioners themselves. And so they understood, the sacredness, if I can say that, of we're all here to support this thing happening. And then when that sort of these degrees came through, these organisations became very, very heavy in their administrative roles and sucked up more and more. I mean, I'm talking about this sort of the Arts Council funded world, sucked up more and more of those salaries and those positions of gatekeeper and control. And these are really bright people that saw, well, why would I risk, my reputation and a bad review and get chucked off the artistic sort of rostrum when I can get a nice position with holiday pay, sick pay, and I get to choose who I fund and make all the decisions. Yeah. So there's a big chunk of arts administrative people, and I'm not saying that because some are great and we do need some support, but that has sort of sucked up, and that's a very controlling world. Like they love to come and tell you why your work is not as good as it could be, or where you've gone wrong as an artist. And I have been, told, oh, could you storyboard it for us, for example?
Yeah.
And it's like, well, no, because it's sort of in my head and then I make it. And that, that's what happens, actually. And that's a process with other artists who are willing to come along on that journey with me, not in an office when you're holding the purse strings. It's a really uncreative world.
That's really fascinating, because it chimes with my understanding of what's happened in universities, which is obviously that as the various successive governments have tried to make universities more accessible and bring more and more adolescents and 20-somethings into universities, so many degrees, it's not news, have been sort of invented from scratch. Like, so many areas have become professionalised. And even the arts degrees, like the fine art degree, and I've hung around with quite a lot of fine artists, it's so much more about your notebooks and your process and your concepts and stuff that you can mark, and the written element, as opposed to necessarily the visual element. And I believe that's true in other artistic disciplines as too, because you need to know how to market, and you need to know how to rank the students, and how to get a first and a 2-1 and a 2-2, and then you need a lot of stuff about what that looks like. And before you know it, you have, with art, quite often it seems to me, you can't really say why that's brilliant, but that doesn't fit for the professionalisation of the arts generally. So as this is happening in the arts world, it's obviously being supported by a culture in universities, which is making everything into technique that you can learn and that you can pass on through reading a book and so on, which isn't necessarily what art was supposed to be in the first place.
And just going back to like your whole sort of marketing of the image, I think that's really interesting, and that sort of young, from my own experiences anyway, young dancers are coming in already with a sort of ready-made Instagram identity, which everything has to sort of reflect those values of that, as opposed to the values of something bigger or wider or greater, which
or no values.
Or no values.
It'd be absolutely amazing if people could come in with no values. Like, it doesn't mean they've got bad values, they just don't have an evaluative position as part of their identity when they arrive. But that isn't what's happening.
But there was always, particularly in my profession, this sense of the apprentice. You are the apprentice, and in ballet you go up through the ranks. You were a dancer before you became a choreographer, because you needed to learn. You can only learn the trade of choreography by being a dancer, or there are exceptions, but there's very few exceptions to that rule. And you have to learn, like you have to go through learning from a master, and it's literally body to body, person to person, is a pedagogic tradition. And now I think within that sort of university sector or the conservatoire sector, that in itself is seen as an act of oppression.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure it is. But you can see why, because it's essentially elitist, and it's essentially something that only a few people could have access to, I assume, to have that sort of intense relationship with a mentor. And it's open to abuse, and has been open to abuse for generations. And people have become much more savvy about that. So in an attempt to sanitize the entire thing and lay it all open, they've got rid of these special relationships, as far as I can see. They're trying to weed them out of every sector, and it's supposed to become absolutely generic. You can't be alone with an older man, and if you are, the door has to be open, and I don't know. I mean, obviously, there are good reasons for all of these things, as well as disadvantages as a result of them.
But I feel it particularly in the dance world, where one, certainly when I work with children, you always are very careful, and you understand safeguarding about rules around touch and different types of touch. But in the studio with adults, you now have to do that. And so there's this kind of like boundary all the time of checking permissions, and the spontaneity seems to sort of die. Human interaction seems to die with this set of rules around it.
Right. So I guess what we're saying is that out of this highly professionalised, highly image-conscious, cautious world has developed its own kind of currents of authoritarianism and anxiety as well, about overstepping boundaries and not knowing where the boundaries are exactly, or making up, some people being in charge of the boundaries, I guess, as well, and deciding where they are for other people.
And you can say something as a joke or in passing, and that can be then the basis of an accusation, and the accusation becomes
right.
the fact.
It's the most horrifying thing of all.
Yeah.
For me, I mean, jokes are part of why life is good. I think.
Let's move on to, you talked about like the imagination and the relationship between creativity, imagination and reality. Some philosophers have thought that fiction is a danger to the youth.
Some.
Some.
Yes. I was saying don't pin it down. I can't remember who. Plato, probably.
Probably Plato.
Yeah, well, there is this anxiety about, this is how I would put it anyway, in my former role. Imagination occupies this strange mental territory, somewhere between belief and desire, I would say. So you can really get fully immersed in fantasy realms or fictional worlds, and really it can feel like it's real. And that's why people cry at the theatre and get absolutely gripped in novels, and it's part of the joy of it. But obviously it runs kind of parallel to the earth, as it were. You can get involved in fantasies or fictions that have got nothing to do with what's really going on in front of you, or you can incorporate bits of the real world into your fantasies, and people do all the time. Kids do when they tell make-believe games and they use objects around them and use the properties of the objects around them as stimuli for their next imaginative move. And I don't think that as adults, we're doing things that we've obviously got more complicated and sophisticated ways of doing that, but that we're on a continuum in that way. So it's like belief in the sense that it can feel really real while you're in that state, but we can also snap out of it. Like we can stop watching the film and go to the loo. We can eat popcorn while we're crying. There's ways in which you behave in quite strangely, and you wouldn't be like that if you were really grieving or frightened or whatever the state was. And it's also very much infused quite often with desire, eros, or how you want the world to be, or how you fear the world. It can be infused with paranoia or neuroses. It's not checked. It's not evidence-based fantasy and imagination. It's got its own kind of logic, or it doesn't have any kind of logic really for some people. And that's another thing, that we don't require of fiction that it makes sense.
Yeah,
it can contain lots of different elements that don't fit together, and if we tried to make them fit together, it wouldn't work. But we don't care, because that's not the point. The point is not about discovering the world as it is, but engaging in something more fantastical. So I think that's, how we should think of it. And we should both recognise its value and its limits. And I feel at the moment that we don't have a good way of thinking about that. We seem to take fiction very seriously. So we require that, the author can only write fiction about that which they've had lived experience of, or white people can only write about white people, or gay people can only write about gay people, and so on, which is weird, because that makes no sense to me in terms of what imagination and fiction is. It's not supposed to be that plumbed in, rule-bound to the way the world is. It's obviously inflected by desire. For many of us, get lost in fantasies about the way that we'd like the world to be, but it isn't that way. And we're losing the capacity as a society to say, no, that's actually not true. It's just what you'd want it to be, but it isn't actually true. So, yeah, I don't know.
That makes me really think about 7 or 8 years ago, I started to kind of investigate conspiracy theory. And so I, first of all, started with workshopping and interviewing. It was sort of like teenagers, young people and students about all the big conspiracy theories out there. And it was remarkable. They knew everything. They knew everything from around HIV and Ebola to the Illuminati and pop star brainwashing to all sorts of kind of like slightly fringe conspiracy theories. And I remember one young, very articulate man saying, well, I was like, well, do you believe in these conspiracy theories? Remember, we're talking like 7 or 8 years ago. He said, well, the thing is, we both believe in them and we don't believe in them. And we hold that at the same time. And I said, well, why is that? And he said, well, because the narrative of what we're told in the news seems to have broken down and we don't believe that anymore. And I remember saying, this is really dangerous because it creates a vacuum. It creates a vacuum in these young, I mean, some of them really young, I can believe primary school kids knew all about these conspiracy theories. Beyonce, Katy Perry, Lady Gaga, all these pop stars.
What are these conspiracy theories?
So there's a conspiracy theory is that there's also a real cover-up. So MK Ultra is a real brainwashing program. And it was stopped in the 70s. The CIA invested millions and millions trying to work out if they could actually wipe people's brains. It was shut down, it was closed, they paid millions in compensation. But the conspiracy theory is that they kept going and Disney and the pop industry recruited children to become pop stars that became puppets for the Illuminati. And if you study their videos, it's full of occult and satanic symbolism, which is real occult and satanic symbolism. And so when this sort of, and transhumanism was in one of these kind of conspiracy theories as well. So when this sort of started coming over the hill, I was kind of like, oh, I've seen this happening in young people's belief systems, but that won't catch on. But I think that there is the danger of like, if their reality is deconstructed from quite a young age, maybe they're more vulnerable to.
I don't know, because I think, I defer to your expertise on this particular issue, but I do think with children, that's age appropriate not to know the difference between reality and fantasy. Yeah. And it's why it always makes me laugh when people go on social media and boast about their 7-year-old having all these woke beliefs, because I just think, clearly you're just saying what your parents want you to say. That's age appropriate. And if a child believes in Santa, then if you're giving them all this gender ideology and telling them about Santa, what's the difference? How are they supposed to take that one seriously but not this one? It's crazy. Yeah. So that's all fine. But what's really bad is when the adults now can't tell the difference. And I think, well, maybe the teenagers on. And obviously the internet's got a lot to do with that, because you can just now immerse yourself in what the philosophers would call an epistemic bubble, but where people only ever reflect back to you what you already believe, or increase the algorithms just push you further and further into these directions. And it's obvious the way people are talking about me at the moment, actually, as it happens, and I'm reading these incredibly lurid descriptions of the things I don't believe and things I've never said and things about my personality, and they absolutely, completely committed to them.
Yeah.
And they've seen it, they reinforce each other. And, there's no way I could ever combat those stories now. They're just out there forever. But, they've got nothing to do with reality. So it's interesting to see it actually happening.
Oh, it's just extraordinary. It really is. And if everybody, okay, so if we're not living in reality, or lots of people aren't living reality, and we're all sort of having these performative identities, like, how do we do performances anymore?
Well, I don't know. You tell me. It seems like everyone's performing to some extent now, or thinks they are, or wants to be. And that does seem to erase the difference, or erode the difference between the performances who've got a craft and who know the difference between reality and performance, because that's the point, and everyone else who's in this sort of twilight world of half performing, half believing, and being pushed by all these unconscious forces that they don't really understand.
But it's sort of worse than that, isn't it? Because it's sort of like a Judith Butler sort of absolute nightmare, who said...
You sound like the conspiracy theorist now.
But that your performance of your identity, whether that be a gender identity, is actually more concrete than your sex biological identity.
Well, anything can be anything in this world.
Anything can
be more important. If you want it to be more important, then it is more important. You can just all agree that it's more important, and you can say anyone who disagrees with you is a hater. And that's a cult-like phenomenon. They just push anyone who disagrees with you out into the world of the haters. And then you can rank things any way you like. So, yeah.
Oh,
Gender identity is the most important thing, the most fundamental thing. Everything else is unimportant.
yeah, yeah. And what do you think? I mean, are audiences going to like that?
No, because most people don't live in that world. And I do think that still, like most people aren't online as much as the people that we're talking about are online, and that we're online, I'm online a lot. No, I think once you go out, people still want art, don't they? They want to go and experience, they want to take themselves out of themselves into another world, and they want to explore that world emotionally and learn things about that world, and then come back to the real one, and they know the difference. So I think, from my perspective, looking at the way that the Arts Council, for instance, is funding, it's so dull. It's just unbelievably boring and monotonous. And I live near Brighton, so I see the Brighton Festival programme. And it's just, there's nothing creative, nothing interesting, nothing innovative about it. Everybody is saying exactly the same things over and over and over again. It's queer, 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 queer. Transgression. There's nothing transgressive about it at all. It's like Presbyterianism.
Yeah.
So I just don't see how that's sustainable. I just don't. But I don't know. This is where I'd be interested to know what other people think, because that's from an outsider's perspective.
And that's what really worries me in the business, is that that's being pushed through by the funders. So that's the product that's for sale. The venues who do want to programme, there's not many of us that are still working there, have been cancelled, that do want to put your work on, know that they are running a gamut of who knows what kind of level of complaints they may receive. And so I think there's like a climate of fear that means that interesting, imaginative new work, A, it's not going to get funded, B, it's not going to get programmed, and C, it might get cancelled at the last minute as well if there's too many threats.
Yeah, but I mean, I saw an interesting suggestion today on Twitter, which was like, we really do need a sort of database of how many complaints these venues get.
Yes.
Because I actually don't think they get that many. My suspicion is that really, in every case, it's been a small number. They should probably trace the IP addresses as well to make sure it's not all coming from the same 3 accounts. Because it's just not, I just don't know. I just feel like there's a very small number of people controlling, we're giving them a disproportionate amount of power, and venues need educated in how to strategize about dealing with this. But I don't think anything bad. You've just had a good run and nothing happened.
Yes, but then some of the complaints were coming from staff inside these theatres, and that was the most tricky for the venues to deal with. You have education teams, you have outreach teams, you have sometimes marketing teams, that all have people that are, radically extremist in those. I mean, the good venues, I hope, will sort of bring that out and sort of show it. And if it wasn't me, it would be someone else next. And so for me, there's a hope that venues will then go back to like what is their core values, their core purposes, and their skills and expertise, and why is that person being paid that kind of level of salary to make those decisions, that spends weeks and weeks travelling around the world looking at the alternative versions of dance or theatre or comedy or whatever, and can make those comparisons, as opposed to somebody sat in a venue itself, not doing that work and not getting paid to do that work.
Yeah.
But then you're oppressing everybody with your expertise.
We have produced. I mean, it's not really even their fault, but going along back to the discussion about professionalisation, we've produced a kind of generation. Not all of them by any means, like I say, but nonetheless, it's a sort of self-selecting group. They're looking around for interesting jobs that they can put on Instagram to say, and it has a moral purpose. And then they look for the jobs that look like they might have a moral purpose, like education and outreach. Absolute tick. And then they can go and, lecture poor children about, I don't know, fisting, whatever it is. I'm not joking. There's a sort of moral purpose about sex education now that's quite bizarre. It's like missionaries for deviant sexual practices. But and everyone's got to sit there and not laugh.
and everyone might be naked.
But anyway, whatever they're doing, it gives them some kind of cachet in their own social circles and in their own minds. And these are the people that end up working in these organisations. So they are the biggest problem. They're often running the social media as well.
That's right.
And I don't, and I'm sure that they've been produced. It's not their fault. They're just trying to find a job and trying to find a hero's journey for themselves. I don't blame them. I'm sure I might have even been like them 10, 20 years ago. But organisations need to understand how to gently or even firmly stand up to young people who've got a bee in their bonnet about something that's paralysing the rest of the organisation and stopping it doing from what it's supposed to be doing.
But it's so strange because you have this kind of like hyper or over-sexualisation of children versus a really prudish infantilisation of adult content. You can't...
The two go together.
Yeah, it's like, this is an adult show, it's +12. They don't actually rape each other at all, but, that's sort of needs a warning and a trigger warning, and it's like...
I know. I did, when I used to write a Substack, I did this piece on the Family Sex Show, which was an Arts Council, I think it was Arts Council funded.
It was, yeah.
But one of the funniest things they did, this poor group of Cambridge graduate women who were now queer produced this thing called the Family Sex Show, which had naked adults on stage and was all about fisting and so on.
It's like zero plus.
They had a glossary on their website that tried to educate people about stage management terms and sexual terms at the same time. So it would go like, it would go like stage left, squirting. It was all in alphabetical order. And it got to the point where you were reading it and you're going, is this a stage term like backstage? Or is this a sex term? It was really confusing. But it was all done so it was straight faced.
Yeah,
it was like education.
Very earnest. Oh dear. So for the last sort of 10 minutes or so, I'm gonna. This is the question that both of us said we didn't know the answer to. Let's give it a stab. What's the purpose of art?
Oh. God. Obviously, I think there probably isn't just one purpose, but the thing I'd like to get back to, is to move away from the pedagogy and the morality and the didacticism and to something much more ambiguous and ambivalent, and that you can that has meaning, like deep meaning, but it doesn't wear it on its face. And I feel there's something amazing about going to see a piece of art where you come away and really think about what it meant and how it made you feel often as well. That's got nothing to do with the rational side of things, but just a kind of visceral experience. And there's still lots of art out there that does that. But when I look at what's being funded, again, like I say, it seems to always have this kind of quite heavy-handed messaging, which I find dull.
Yeah.
Dull and kind of not really what creativity and aesthetic experience is about. But what do you think?
Well, I suppose what I feel the job of the artist is to do is to sort of keep their eyes open and almost not blink and not flinch, whatever it is you see. And you can go out and look at the big problems and the big issues and the terrifying things, but I try not to prejudge the results right from the very beginning. I try and have a kind of an open-eyed approach to the world. Like Otto Dix, the artist, sort of said, just never look away, even if you find it repulsive or scary or terrifying or beautiful or wonderful, try not to look away. But then what that process is of turning that into a work of art, particularly I can't just go to a room and paint it. I have to be with other real humans with their own psychology and their own eyes and their own minds, is then it has to be a journey of sort of trust and play.
Play.
I think the best ideas have come out of quite a playful environment, and creating that in this current climate is quite difficult.
We've just lost play completely. You can't joke, you can't laugh, you can't you can't inhabit voices that are clearly provocative and deliberately controversial even. Yeah. So
I mean, one of the beauties of coming back to Five Soldiers is really understanding that world so well and understanding that discipline. So I can say, no, that's wrong. No, I'm just, that's what the military would say. And on the other is that dark humour. And when you explain to young people who've probably never thought about it before, when you're exposed to some of the most disgusting and horrifying things that normal people will never see, and that's your job, you've got to find a way to try and stay sane. And the humour is part and parcel of that world. And so to bring that into the studio a little bit was for me a way through this difficult paranoia that it creates, where everything you might get a complaint on Twitter, after that rehearsal.
Yeah. I mean, one of the last things I did at Sussex was before I left, and because I got into a new office about 3 days before I had to leave again, but I put up a picture of Evelyn Waugh because I really love Evelyn Waugh, and I've always loved Evelyn Waugh. And obviously he thinks atrocious things. I mean, for his time, I don't know, you could argue about that, but, there's some really racist material in Evelyn Waugh. But other bits just make me laugh. He's just got such a black sensibility, humour-wise. And I just thought this is quite funny to be putting up a picture of Evelyn Waugh at University of Sussex. Then I took it down again and left.
and so I think keeping a sense of humour is hard, but it's probably like the only way to, the bizarreness.
Totally. Also, it takes the heat out of the hysteria around it. Like, I do not want to myself, like you said at the beginning, I do not want to meet hysteria with hysteria. I do not want to get as outraged. I mean, our own side, Rosie, my side, we have our own conspiracy theories, and we have our own kind of ludicrous outrages and pearl clutching. God, this is being filmed, unfortunately. But it's true, and I just don't. So humour is a good way to cut through and bring it back down to human-sized when emotions are just running completely too high, I find. Well, it keeps me sane anyway.
Yeah. And having these conversations, I think because of that trap of COVID and the online world, I think like everybody kind of did get a bit hysterical in certain aspects, but actually, being in person, meeting, talking, doing, actually doing stuff is kind of nice.
I think the impact of COVID and lockdown over all of us, will take years to work out what exactly happened, but it definitely, in my life, had a big effect that I did not. At the time, I thought it was great because I'm pretty antisocial. I don't like to talk to people, and I didn't have to go into my university and face people, so I thought it was great. But I think, generally speaking, it's obviously affected us culturally in ways we now need to correct and also analyse and think about. Yeah.
A huge thank you to Kathleen Stock.